we answer questions suggested by our members on the NRA, CNN, and the Harris campaign. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over to our website today to stay up to date with what's going on with guns in America. You can subscribe to our free newsletter, or you can buy a membership that'll get you exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and reporting that you won't find anywhere else. It'll also give you the ability to be on the show and to ask questions, coincidentally, in our Q&A episodes, because this is a Q&A episode, and all the questions we have came directly from Reload members. I've got with me today the one and only Jake Fogleman, our contributing writer. Welcome back to the main interview episode. Jake, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, good to be here. I always enjoy these Q&A episodes. We do them, periodically to hear from our members, and they always seem to ask really great questions. And I know you and I enjoy diving into some of the questions they ask. Absolutely.
And this week, we, unsurprisingly, I think, are going to start with some questions about the NRA. We just had the remedies phase of the New York trial conclude, sort of wrapping up, almost wrapping up. There's still a little bit to go here, as we discussed on the news update podcast, which came out last Friday, but was also filmed like a couple minutes ago to give you a peek behind the scenes here. But the trial's almost over after, a half decade of this, maybe even more, really. If you sort of the first big story on NRA corruption issues came out in 2018 at the Wall Street Journal. So yeah, almost really 6 years, I guess. Pretty wild how long it's been. But now we're at the end phase of this, and the judge ruled that the NRA will not get a court-appointed overseer or monitor, as the New York Attorney General had requested, and that Wayne LaPierre will be banned from working for the group in an official fiduciary role for the next 10 years. But also he's left some more potentially significant reforms up for discussion before he decides exactly what to do on them. So that's where we're at right now, just to give people a quick update on it. But we have a couple questions from members on this front, right?
That's right. I'm going to start with the second one on the list because it kind of deals directly with sort of what you just led off with sort of where we're at in the trial. This comes to us from Reload member Bob, and he says he's unclear if the NRA has made sufficient changes yet to prevent a repeat of sort of the malfeasance of the last year, 5 years or so. He says he notices that there's some new folks on the board. Obviously, we've covered the reformers that got elected. But he also knows that there are still some longtime Wayne LaPierre loyalists still in positions of power. And he asks, is that true? One. And then two, he asks, is there any, he wants to know if we think the organization can be trusted to not repeat those things. Is there anything in place preventing that from happening again? So what do you think on that, Steve?
Yeah, well, certainly we'll do our best to give you guys what our view of where things are at, but people have to make up their own minds as to whether they want to support the NRA or whatnot. That's kind of how we want to approach things at the Reload, right? We're here to report to you, and then you guys can make up your minds about what to do. But on this front, there are several Wayne LaPierre associates, I guess you would call them. The reformers, some of the reformers, the more aggressive ones, Phil Journey and Jeff Knox, would call them the cabal. That's what they've called sort of the old guard people at the NRA for years now. And, those would include people like former NRA President Charles Cotton, David Coy, current NRA President Bob Barr, would be folks on that list that are still in positions of significant influence within the NRA. Obviously, Bob Barr is literally the president of the NRA. That was, interestingly, during the election, the leadership election, there was a slate that came out from the nominating committee, which has been controlled, at least up to that point, by your more old guard sort of NRA leaders who, were much more supportive of Wayne LaPierre than a lot of the reformer folks like Journey or Rocky Marshall or some of these other guys. And they put out a slate of leaders for this leadership election. The nominee, that's how it usually works. Generally, the nominating committee picks a slate of people to fill the president. The NRA has this weird system of president, first vice president, second vice president, and they've got, secretary and treasurer. And, but that would be put up, and then that would be the group that wins. And there isn't, for a very long time, there was not much opposition, and there were no real stakes in these leadership elections. Once the nominating committee decided that was kind of what was going to make it through. And then you had a couple of attempts over the last 5 years at sort of doing show votes to put somebody else up who never won, until this May, when the reformers ran their own slate against the nominating committee slate. And Bob Barr was on the nominating committee slate. He won, and the argument that you got from some of the board members who supported him was that they wanted to show both continuity and reform at the same time. And that's kind of how that election came out, with Bob Barr as the idea of continuity. He's a former congressman. So he also has, obviously a lot of political experience for that kind of role. And then the rest of the people who were elected first, second vice president were reformers, and same for the executive vice president, which is the role that Wayne LaPierre used to have before he resigned earlier this year. That was also a reformer candidate who got that position as well. So long story short, there are still people on the NRA board and in key positions like chairman of the audit committee. That's Charles Cotton currently, or NRA president Bob Barr, who were more of the old guard NRA guys. Now, this ruling, one of the significant possibilities here, one of the reforms the judge wants to see is removing anyone from the audit committee, not necessarily from the board altogether, but potentially from at least leadership positions in the audit committee. Oh, excuse me, man. I'm like dying here. I don't know why. I'm just coughing up a storm. I apologize for anyone listening with headphones. But the judge listed 6 reforms that he wants to see. And one of them was remove the people on the audit committee today who were on the audit committee at the time that the jury identified significant failings. So, for instance, related party transactions. There were several related party transactions that the jury found were inappropriate, didn't comply with New York law. And those were all approved by the audit committee previously, retroactively in a lot of cases, like meaning that the audit committee went back and said, we didn't know about these before, but we're saying they're fine now. Now, the jury, to be fair, the jury didn't find every related party transaction was inappropriate. So it wasn't a clean sweep for the AG or anything, but there were several, like Wayne LaPierre's wife, Susan LaPierre, her hair and makeup was paid for by the NRA, and the audit committee approved that. And the jury found that didn't comport with New York law. So the judge wants people who were on the committee at the time, which would include Charles Cotton, to not be in the same positions now. Because part of his idea, if you read the analysis piece that I did on this for members, he kind of wants to see a break from the old NRA, the Wayne LaPierre led NRA, where this corruption happened, and the new NRA. He's very much of the mind that the internal reformers that exist there, people like Sonia Rawling who's the current treasurer, who was early on whistleblower. Bill Bockenberg, who's the first vice president, that was on that reformer ticket. Mark Vaughn, another guy who's second vice president, was on the reformer ticket. Some of these folks, he was very much of the mind that they're trying to change things. He was impressed by the recent elections. These are things that he took into account when looking at this. And he wants, it seems from reading the transcript in the case, that he kind of wants basically a new face for the NRA, and he recognizes that some of these old guard players at the NRA, while they may even be well-intentioned, that they didn't stop these problems from occurring and shouldn't be necessarily kept in positions of power because of that. And so that's one of the things he suggested, and one of the things you could see as a significant reform or change that may further tip the balance of power inside the organization, if he follows through on that. But we don't exactly know what's going to happen with these suggestions. They seem a little bit more than just, oh, I think you guys should do this because they're good ideas, and kind of further along the lines of, this is what I think is going to help fix the NRA, and I want to see this happen.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the gist of it. He asked about like what can be done that I can trust what's going to happen to the NRA, and that's sort of it. It's whatever ends up being the outcome of those sort of recommendations that are a little more than just like, oh, here's an idea. It's more like, I would like to see this happen. Please figure out a way to make this happen. And then whatever happens after that will kind of be, up to the listeners to whether or not they think that's sufficient.
He kind of wanted a third way. It seemed like he didn't agree with the Attorney General's approach, which was, he thought was too heavy handed, should be more of a last resort approach to put a government official in the over top of this charity or this nonprofit organization, which is not a common thing, right? This is not a common solution for nonprofit issues. Now, you could argue this is not a common case and all that, but he just didn't think that was the appropriate way to go. But he also didn't think that doing nothing made sense either, which was kind of the NRA. The NRA's argument all along had been kind of, we've already fixed most of these problems. They were all blamed on specific individuals who are not there anymore. And their story kind of got updated as people left along the way. Like when LaPierre resigned, they kind of half-heartedly included him in the people who were the problem category, even though they hadn't done that previously before his resignation. But the judge said, there were individuals who were a problem, but it was also an institutional problem. And there are still people at the NRA who were involved in that didn't, at the very least, did not stop the corruption from happening. So he seemed to be looking for much more targeted changes that he could order. He's looking to do a court order or have them sign a consent decree or something like. He wasn't exactly completely specific on what he's going to do, but this is what he was implying he wants.
Yeah. Good question, though. It's a good question.
Yeah.
Another similar related NRA question from Reload member Chris asks about giving money to the NRA. He asks about influencing elections, where to give money to the NRA to keep it afloat, to influence elections. And it sort of gets to the fact that the NRA is not just one entity. It has multiple entities that do different things, even in its sort of more beleaguered state than it has been in the past. But there are different entities in the NRA that do different things, including focus on influencing elections.
Yeah. And that's how a lot of major political groups work. It's not just one entity that you're dealing with. There isn't just one NRA. There's technically, the NRA, I think, is made up of 7 or 8 groups.
Yeah, I was going to say 8, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at their annual report and see exactly how many groups are in there now. But, the big one is the C4. That's the membership organization. So when you join the NRA, like if you go to a gun show, right, and they're like, hey, join the NRA and you'll get in for free. If you do that, what you're giving money to, what you're joining is the 501c4, which is the membership group. And it has the ability to do some political advocacy, really issue advocacy at a C4. And then what the numbers we talk about when we discuss their political fundraising, that those numbers come from the NRA's Political Action Committee, which is called the Political Victory Fund, or from their Super PAC, which is people have heard of, like the Citizens United decision that created super PACs. And they're basically these groups that can spend an unlimited amount of money in an election and support a candidate, but they can't coordinate with candidates. There's different rules for how all these groups can operate under the law. And that's why you have a collection of a bunch of different groups, because they can do different things. And, and they can often also move money between each other in some ways, that are also governed by the law. But Yeah, if you want to have an impact politically with a donation to the NRA, the most direct way you can do that is by giving to the Political Victory Fund, the PAC. And that requires you to be a member of the NRA, though, in the first place, because they can only raise money from their membership, which is part of the reason that their fundraising has declined in recent years, because the membership has declined. So they have a smaller base of people to try and draw donations from. But that would be, you kind of have to join both. But if you're trying to give a significant amount of money, have a significant impact, that's how you would do it. You join the NRA, you'd give the PVF money. You could also donate directly to the Institute for Legislative Action if you want to have an impact on, say, their lobbying. That's a different arm of the NRA, the Institute for Legislative Action, which focuses more on political lobbying, but also the people there generally are also the ones who oversee the PAC and the super PAC the NRA has. So, it's not, there's a lot of the same people working across these divisions. Like the political people work on several different groups, and they even have to, for tax purposes, they have to divide up when their time is spent working for this one and their time is spent working for that one. And so there's a lot of rules that go into it, but yeah, I mean, generally speaking, that's how you would donate to influence policy if you want to do that through the NRA, which is frankly still the best way, or the most significant way you're going to do it. It's still the largest group that have, as far as gun rights PACs go, by far. Yeah. Even with the recent declines that we've covered. And then, of course, if you want to do things like support the safety and training side of the NRA or the competitive shooting side of the NRA, that stuff you can donate to what's called the NRA Foundation. And that's a 501c3. And that's where donations would be tax deductible, unlike your NRA membership or your donations to the Political Victory Fund. Those aren't tax deductible. But donations to the NRA Foundation are, because that money can only be spent on those charitable programs, things that are non-political essentially, but promote like safe shooting or youth shooting, things of that nature, which a lot of people, frankly, support the NRA for those purposes. So, right. That if you're looking for that, you'd go to the foundation. If you're looking for the politics stuff, you'd go to the PAC, most likely. Yeah,
that pretty much covers it. Yeah. Moving on from NRA stuff, we have some more political, strategic sort of questions. We have a one from a Reload member here that asks sort of an interesting one. He asks if a Harris and a Democrat-controlled Congress could potentially end up being the best thing to happen to the gun rights movement or the 2A community. He says if such a combo
there's a
were
twist
to enact,
coming though.
Yeah,
got a twist on this one.
If such a combo were to enact a nationwide categorical ban and confiscation scheme, would it force SCOTUS to act? Is sort of his question, because the subtext here is that he's maybe perhaps frustrated that the Supreme Court hasn't taken up a categorical ban case, an assault ban case, a magazine ban case. And he's wondering, would that be the final straw to make them take up a case? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, and we have a couple of members in this list that are not super happy about the Supreme Court's sort of dragging its feet on these kinds of cases. Well, I think there's two things to say on this one. One, obviously you look at either party and the policy difference on guns is extremely stark in the vast majority of cases. And so this is something we've talked about and how that's actually political weakness for the gun rights movement, right? Because you're basically beholden to a single party and they can kind of take you for granted in a lot of cases, which is sort of seems like that's what Donald Trump is doing right now. Yeah, we talked about this a lot because it's like, yeah, what are you going to do? Go and vote for Kamala Harris, who's moderating on the issue of a mandatory buyback of gun confiscation, but that just puts her still at wanting to ban the sale of the country's most popular rifle. Right? It's not generally a position that's going to attract a lot of gun voters, right? It may not. She may be trying to just not alienate as many people as the other position, but it leaves you with this on policy, which is not the only thing to consider, of course, in your vote. But on policy, the choice is pretty obvious. But so he's getting into this idea of like, well, maybe okay, fair enough. But maybe if we force the issue by having Democrats pass a nationwide assault weapons ban, maybe that would actually be good in the long run because the Supreme Court would strike it down under Bruin or something along those lines is the idea here. One, I would start with like just the political realities of if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, I don't think she could actually pass an assault weapons ban in this environment because the Republicans, regardless of what happens at the presidential race, unless it turns into some sort of rout, some sort of blowout, which seems extremely unlikely given the last several elections and where the polling is at today, it's most likely that even if Harris wins, even if she does fairly well in the electoral college, right? Let's say she wins the Rust Belt states, the blue wall states in the Northeast, Midwest, and she wins the Sun Belt states, Arizona and Nevada and even Georgia. It's still not very likely that Democrats are going to keep control of the Senate because of the map right now is extremely favorable to Republicans this year. The Senate's only up every 6 years. Senators are up, so you don't get like half the Senate up at once. You get a third of it up at once in each election, and this time around, you're getting a lot more vulnerable Democrats than you are Republicans. And so there's several pickup opportunities for West Virginia, for instance, is almost guaranteed to become Republican, which would already put them, even if the other races don't pan out, they'd still have a majority. So I'm just saying, on the practical front, even if Kamala Harris wins, and I think whoever wins the presidency is likely to win the House, that's usually how things go. But this time around, it's unlikely that a Democrat could win the presidency and win the Senate in a relatively close race, which I think is what's going to happen. So, but even if she did, it's unlikely that they could get to 60 seats unless politics changes drastically between now and the next presidential election, which is always possible, but not likely. And then even if they did something like blow up the filibuster, right now, if there was no filibuster, I still don't think you could get an assault weapons ban through the Senate. There's not 50 votes for it. So just to discuss the practical politics of an assault weapons ban. If one passed, let's say it happens anyway, right? We get in this hypothetical. It could spur the Supreme Court to act faster because of the number of people affected. But honestly, they already have plenty of opportunities ahead of them to take an assault weapons ban case. And I don't want to underplay how much the practical side of things impacts the Supreme Court because we've talked about it before. It is something that they clearly consider. They don't just go to the logical endpoint of every test that they make. There's clearly some consideration for the practical side of things at the Supreme Court. And so maybe they would put more weight into reviewing a national ban than they would any of these state bans. But I just don't think it's something that's like necessary for them to take up a case like this. I don't know. What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, I don't think it would be good for the Second Amendment community because one, like you said, if politics got to a point where they had the numbers and they had the political will where they felt comfortable taking a vote to ban an assault weapon or pass an assault weapon ban and a mandatory buyback scheme, that means the gun rights movement has already lost so much political clout that it almost doesn't matter. Even if the Supreme Court strikes it down as unconstitutional, that means you have that much political will for such a policy that you might see them retaliate and say, okay, we're going to pack the court. We're going to, X, Y, Z.
If you got to that level of political support that they could pass something like that, especially something with a mandatory like confiscation attached to it.
Yeah.
You're at the levels of support where they could even maybe get a constitutional amendment through.
Right. Exactly.
Or some harebrained scheme to pack the court or something, which they have been much more willing to discuss.
Right. They flirt with it all the time.
Yeah. So if you got to that level, you might be able to get constitutional amendments like the California governor has proposed, or some other short circuiting of the constitutional system, like President Biden is proposing with this court packing scheme that he's got. As things stand now, that court packing, I don't even know why he's doing that, because it's not going to go anywhere. It's just sort of like a vanity thing for him. I mean, the Supreme Court's not very popular at the moment. And so I guess maybe they're just trying to exploit that by saying we want to offer reforms or whatever, but it's not going to realistically go anywhere today, or probably even if Kamala Harris won this election. So I don't know. But either way, this is just not necessary for the court to take this up. They have a lot of opportunities. They seem to have a number of justices who are fairly eager to take up a case like this, right? We had a dissent that we talked about in one of the denials. It seems like, as actually one of our other members got to this later on, Paul mentioned that he doesn't think that we're going to get to this Sullivan's ban case until one is at what's called an interlocutory stage. And he's probably right. That seems to be what the issue is, right? Why don't you explain that for people, what interlocutory means, and why we think the court's probably waiting for that.
Yeah. So the court has been receiving appeals to take an assault weapon ban case, and in almost every instance, other than the one at GVR after Bruin, they were all in what's called an interlocutory posture, which means it hasn't reached the merits decision yet. It's all folks appealing a denial of a preliminary injunction or something like that. And which is, supposed to be an emergency temporary, stage of a case. And it's before, actually either saying this is unconstitutional or it is constitutional. And so that's basically what Thomas, if listeners will recall, we covered this. Justice Thomas, when the court was asked once again to take up the Illinois assault weapon ban case, Justice Thomas said, he basically wrote at length why he thinks it's unconstitutional and he thinks it's important for the court to take this issue. But he's saying we need to respect procedure. We need to let things run their course in the lower courts before we jump in. And that's basically what they've hinted at in all these other cases as well. When they wrote previously about the Bruin response bills, for instance, in New York, they said something similar where it's like, we ought to keep a close eye on this, but it's only at the injunction stage, so we can't step in.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where the court's signaling that it could get involved. Let's be clear. They could do whatever they want, frankly.
Right.
They just don't want to do that for this issue. And that seems to be pretty across the board from what we've seen. They're not willing to go and intervene at these early stages in these gun cases. They may be willing to do that in other cases. That's shadow doctrine. If you ever heard people talk about that, that's sort of them intervening early without, waiting for the merits stage to reach them. But it seems on this issue that you don't necessarily read into them denying some of these requests for cert as them disagreeing with the plaintiffs in the case. They just seem to have a procedural preference for these to waiting for these to make it to them on the actual waiting for everybody. Basically, they want the lower courts to hear everything first so that they don't have to hear new things, which, it makes sense. They're the Supreme Court. They want to have a fully developed case before it gets up to them. That's what they would like to do in most cases, I think. And it certainly seems to be what they're doing now. To this end, we do have a question from Stephen that also deals with the Supreme Court, which is it fair to say that perhaps Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett are not sympathetic to striking down a hardware or, in other words, an assault weapons ban? I want to hear your take on this. What do you think where these justices are at? I guess specifically Roberts and Barrett are ones that people often are concerned about on the right with where they might come down on cases. What do you think their feelings are in these hardware ban cases?
I don't think it's fair to say just yet that they're not sympathetic. So they're sort of, I've heard court commentators talk about it. This is actually a 3-3-3 court rather than a 6-3 court, because you sort of have your ideological conservative justices, and that would be your Alitos, your Thomases, and your Gorsuches. And then you have your more institutionalist justices that they talk about, like Roberts, Barrett, Kavanaugh. And in that institutionalist sort of cohort, you already have Kavanaugh on the record essentially doing a Bruin analysis of an assault weapon ban in Heller 2 in 2011. So I think people aren't so concerned about him. And I think it's just a matter that Roberts and Barrett seem to be sort of more Burkean, more cautious in their approach. They don't like to do big disruptive, that's why they're always writing concurrences, trying to soften whatever opinion comes out. That's why Roberts wrote the shall issue permits are okay in the Bruin decision, even though I'm not going to explain how. And then Kavanaugh joined him in that as well. That's a good point. So I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that they're at a point where they're not sympathetic to an assault ban. It's just that they haven't had the opportunity or the inclination even to sort of opine one way or another, because it's not really the type of judges they are, right? Whereas Thomas and Alito seem to relish taking an opportunity to say, hey, lower courts, we're keeping an eye on you on this issue. That's not really the style of Roberts and Barrett, who seem to be much more institutionalist and maybe hesitant and cautious in their approach to being judges.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think I've seen anything from Barrett or Roberts that would indicate they wouldn't strike down a ban on something like an AR-15, given the popularity and the standards that they've set for the Second Amendment cases. It's kind of hard to imagine them not striking it down, but I think they're much more wary. Most of the court, not just those two, is much more wary about things further out from that less popular stuff.
Yeah,
that may be implicated in Bruin, but you can look at Rahimi and see the court is not trying to go to the absolute logical ends of these standards that they're setting up. I think they want to keep things relatively stable. Yeah, that sort of institutionalist, as you've described there, I don't think they're going to strike down the NFA, for instance.
Right.
I think that maybe parts of it, you might have a decent chance with the suppressor part just because of how popular suppressors are these days. But generally speaking, they're not going to probably undo the felon in possession ban. A lot of these things most federal gun laws are modern because you didn't have a federal gun law before the 20th century, which would sort of imply that most of them under the Bruin standard are on very shaky ground. But I don't know that the court is going to go through and throw out every federal gun law. I just don't think that's going to happen. Even if you could make a Bruin based case to do that. And that's more where I see, and not just Roberts and Barrett, but, Kavanaugh or even Gorsuch. I mean, It was an 8-1 ruling in Rahimi, right? They didn't really give you you can read Thomas's dissent and I think that's where a lot of the pro-gun people who looked at Bruin, what they were thinking of it. And even, we had Jeff Charles, Professor Charles from Pepperdine, who's a Bruin critic on the show. And he was saying that's where he was viewing what Thomas said in his dissent. That's more what he was viewing the Bruin decision as. And it doesn't, obviously the rest of the court didn't view it that way, including the other 4 or other 5 conservative justices. So, I think the more radical the practical effect is of striking down a gun law, the less likely the court's going to do it. And so that, assault weapons bans, they're not nationwide. They're really only things that exist in the deepest blue states at this point.
Right. Like 10 or 11 states. Yeah.
Yes. It's much more akin to Bruin, to those carry restrictions, than it is to the domestic violence restraining order gun ban, which basically every state has and is a federal law as well. So we'll see what they do. It's not guaranteed either way, but I don't, that's the impression I get from this court at the very least.
I think that's a good point.
Do one more here. We got a couple of CNN questions. Let's do that. I guess if you want, I think the very end here, we got some CNN questions. People interested in what's up with CNN.
A couple Reload members asked have you personally invited any of your CNN colleagues to go to the range with you? And then 2, Another CNN question. He's asked, ever since you became a contributor for CNN, and there's been some revised firearm guidelines by the AP apparently. And he asked, have you noticed any improvement when it comes to firearms related news in mainstream outlets? So take a stab at either one of those.
Yeah, well, we haven't done anything officially as like take your CNN colleagues to the range day sort of thing. But yeah, no, I mean, I know a number of my CNN colleagues. A number of them are also gun owners, and I've been to the range with several of them. I mean, sure, I'll give one example. I don't think would be bothered by this. Sure, Michael Singleton. He's been on the show before. He's a CNN contributor. He has his own gun show, Guns Out TV, which I've been on before and I'm a big fan of. I went to his range day. He lives here in Northern Virginia like I do. He had a range day at our one of the nice ranges nearby. I think they're having one soon, actually. People want to go and check that out, go over to Guns TV and see what they've got going on. But yeah, I mean, I've been to the range with a number of my CNN colleagues, not as part of any sort of official thing. It's just, I think people would be good to remember that like people who work at CNN are people. They're human beings. Like they're people, and many of them have all kinds of different interests, and some of that includes gun ownership. So, I'd like to, and that extends beyond CNN too, to a number of the other outlets I've written for in the past, The Atlantic or, National Review. I've been shooting with a bunch of people who write for those outlets or work for them. And it's not a totally uncommon thing. What I'd like to do is get a bit more of an organized, class going for that. That's something I want to do. Like I do the National Journalism Center class, right? And I'd like to do that for established media outlets too, just to give a little bit of additional training. I think for reporters who talk about this subject, I think it'd be beneficial. So I'm looking to put together something like that in the future here, and hope to get it a bit further. As far as my time at CNN and how the industry has changed perhaps in recent years on the gun issue. I'm just one person, first of all. So it's, and we're just one outlet here. But,
you mean you haven't single-handedly changed the state of journalism?
Yeah. I mean, we gotta be realistic about what I can accomplish as one dude, but or what we can accomplish as one outlet, because that's part of our mission here at the Reload is just to improve reporting on firearms generally. But I've had good experiences so far, especially at CNN. They will often ask for my advice. Now, I'm not the only person they have there to consult on firearms. There's a whole team of people that, including Michael being somebody that that I know producers will go to for good advice on this stuff as well. But I've never been in a situation where they were trying to get me to say something I don't believe, right? That's the number one thing for me. Like if that ever happened, I'd be out, and that's never happened. I'm on my third contract with CNN, and it's been a very positive experience so far. And I think I've been able to help both in front of the camera and behind the camera when there have been situations where they needed accurate information on, whatever is going on in the news that relates to guns. They will come to me and ask me, and I have a great deal of respect for that. In my experience, and not just at CNN, but I think CNN is particularly adept at this. It's like the people there want to get things right. They might not always. They're human, like you are. We don't always get things right here at the Reload either, but they do. They have that desire, and so my interactions with the fact-checking people, your normal digital reporters or the on-camera reporters, they want to have the most accurate information possible as fast as they can get it, because that's their job. And so, I think it's been positive. I think that the media, generally, that the industry has improved so much that like the Reload is no longer necessary because now the mainstream outlets understand this issue really well. No, right? We're not at that point. We may not ever get to that point. But I think the places where I've been directly involved, NJC, CNN, The Atlantic, the Discourse Magazine, a number of other places where I've been published, I've had a good experience. And I think that there has been some improvement on that front. I still wish that we would get more. One of my goals too is to try and broaden the scope of coverage, because one of my main issues with major media outlets and guns is that they really only cover very specific stories, mostly mass shootings, some legislation, but there's so much more to the world of guns in America and the gun owning community. There's a lot more stories to be told there. And we try to highlight some of those, but I would also like to see other outlets spend some more time talking about that. And so that's one of my long-term goals, and we're not there yet, but I do think there's been progress.
Yeah, I would tend to agree, especially, I'm not in these rooms, but as an outside observer, every segment they've had you on for CNN, I thought it has been, sort of a kudos to them kind of moment for letting you come and speak your piece and not turn it one into like two talking heads going at each other with different points of view. It's more like, here's the facts. Here's why it's relevant. Here's why it's important. And they just let it breathe. And I think that's been one of the best
things about my time at CNN is they're not trying to make me into a talking head or a debate, just your classic cable news debate thing where two people yell at each other or whatever for 5 minutes. It's been much more focused than that and much more valuable, I think. So I've been really happy with that. And, but that's all the time we've got for you guys today. Appreciate the questions that we got. Really enjoyed answering them with you, Jake, and I look forward to doing this again relatively soon. If you want to be one of the people who asks a question, make sure you sign up for the Reload today. Go over and buy a membership. It's how we support our reporting. It's how we are able to do this. And you also, of course, get a bunch of perks. In addition to asking questions on the Q&As, you'll get the podcast a day early. You'll also be able to appear on the show, which we have a member segment coming up relatively soon, I believe. And, of course, you'll get access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and reporting that you will not find anywhere else. So, go ahead and check out our membership options. And then after that, head over to the Dispatch and look at them. We've got them as our sponsor again this week. And I'll tell you here, I'm going to change shirts real quick and go back in time to when I filmed this ad originally and tell you why I like the Dispatch as well and why I think they're a good fit. If you like us, you'll probably like them. All right, here we go. Okay, it is time once again to talk about the Dispatch. We're doing a promo swap. We've been doing it for a little while now, and it's a pretty easy thing for me to get behind because I've been a paying subscriber at the Dispatch really since it launched. And I think it's one of the best publications out there, especially in, your center right media, your conservative media, in large part because they focus like we do here at the Reload on hard news reporting first. That's what they were founded to do. That's where they put a lot of their energies. I read the Morning Dispatch every single day, to keep up to date with what's going on in the country, in politics and in news from a national perspective. And I would highly recommend it to anybody who's listening. There's a free trial if you follow the link in our bio here or down below in the description over at the Reload's website or in the newsletter. You'll find the link to that free trial so you can, not just take my word for it, but go and try out a subscription over there. You'll get access to all kinds of great original hard news reporting. That's their sort of bread and butter, I would say, especially stuff that, it's great to read the Morning Dispatch because it gives you a little bit of a different approach, a little bit of a different take on these stories that they're finding and that they're reporting, and they're gathering information and bringing it to you. And it just has a different editorial take as well. It's more for the politically homeless, for people like, I think there was 53% in the most recent Pew poll that wanted a different option than what they have in the current presidential election. So if you feel that way, I think you probably find yourself right at home over at the Dispatch. Of course, they have big name and analysts and opinion writers there as well who come from a center right perspective, people you've heard of before, I'm sure. Jonah Goldberg, Steve Hayes, Kevin Williamson, Ala Pundin, if you've been deeply immersed in online media for the last 15 years like I have, one of the best writers out there. And, it continues on down the line. They've got a really great lineup of writers over there. Chris Steyerwalt's another really good one. It's just a fantastic publication. And this is actually getting long. I don't think I'm supposed to go on for this long, but it's easy to do that when I'm talking about the Dispatch, because I have a lot of respect for what they've done. Another independent publication, startup. They've really had a great success, and I think they're the model for our industry, and also a place where you're going to find value if you go over and check them out. So, click the link, get your free trial, try them out for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. But yeah, the Dispatch, head over and check them out.